Okay, welcome to Chapter 5. So we're going to turn our server into a domain controller. So this chapter is all about explaining what that is and how that works. So what the heck is Active Directory? Active Directory is the name of Microsoft's basically network operating system. We've installed server, but we haven't really installed a network operating system on there. So Active Directory is what that does. So why is this significant? Well, quite frankly, all of the network operating systems out in the world, this is probably one of the biggest. And this is how the university, corporate America, uses this exclusively. You have a bunch of machines and you want to be able to manage them. I don't want to just throw a bunch of computers out there and have no control over whatever. I want to be able to, so I can walk to any machine and log in with my own credentials. I don't have to have credentials in every single machine, and they're all configured the same. And it just releases the system administrators from a huge burden. Okay, so now some of this you won't be able to follow along because we haven't yet upgraded our machine. That there is a hands-on component where we're going to do this step by step by step. But right now we haven't done that yet. That's at the end of this week. Okay, so we're not going to be able to we'll watch, but we're not going to do it until after this lecture is over. Okay, cool. So learning objectives on page 125. Understanding the infrastructure, understanding the domain name system, DNS. We're going to have to use a DNS service. Understanding organizational units and containers. Ooh, cool stuff. And accounts and groups. So page 126. So what is Active Directory? Well, it's a distributed database, and they use that term kind of loosely because it's not a database you and I could just crack open and look at. It's kind of hidden away. But it's a database of all the computers and all the users and all the settings that could be applied anywhere. So it is a cool little database, and it contains lots and lots of information. By the way, bad guys would love to be able to get into this, right? Okay. And it's a hierarchical database, meaning that if I create a thing, I'm going to go ahead and use this term organizational unit. I could put something underneath the organizational unit and then another one underneath that, just like a folder structure. Not all of the things in Active Directory you have that kind of control over. Some of them are very fixed and rigid. Others you can do a hierarchy. Okay, so the database contains objects, which typically would be PCs and users and those kind of settings. Things like those are all objects. So Microsoft did not reinvent the wheel and say, hey, let's create a brand new thing. They used this thing called the Lightweight Discovery Access Protocol, LDAP. It had been around a while, and it's kind of a universally accepted thing, so they adopted to use LDAP to create Active Directory. So it still uses the LDAP tools. You can pull up an LDAP tool and point it to your Active Directory server and say, show me all the users, and it would do it. Okay, cool. It uses Kerberos for security. Kerberos is another good, been out there for quite some time, well tested, well appreciated. People trust Kerberos for doing the authentication parts. And then the domain name system. Now, they did make a tweak to this. So in addition to the normal DNS service that you're, right now, for example, at home, my internet service provider provides me a DNS server, okay, to use, right? And DNS server is like the phone book, right? You type in Google and it translates that to an IP address, that guy. Well, there's extra field that had to be added to DNS. Now, it's not rogue. Microsoft approached the standards committee and said, I need to add an extra attribute to DNS to have an ordinary machine discover what the domain controller is, who you are. Where is my domain controller? Okay. So again, they didn't go off on a limb. They actually went to the standards committee and said, we're going to add this field to DNS. Now, the thing is, which means you're going to have to use their DNS from now on. I mean, I won't be able to use the one like at home. I'm not going to be able to use the one from my internet service provider, which is Spectrum. I'm going to have no choice but to use theirs because it has that extra field in it. So we're going to do this in the hands-on, so it won't be too complicated. Okay. So how do you manage this thing? Well, there's a gazillion tools that you get, and the tools are good, okay? I can't demo them yet because we're not there yet, but there's an Active Directory Administrative Center, kind of the big boy. There's users and computers, that kind of makes sense. Domains and trust, if I have multiple domains, like I have a company that I'm a partner with, and maybe I want to allow one or two other people into my network or vice versa. So you'd establish a one-way trust or a two-way trust to another domain tool. Now we kind of, sort of do that, when we log in at the university and then we go to, Canvas. Canvas is not located on the university. It's a third party. They're, I don't know where they are. They're in Kansas someplace. Who cares? But yet they allow us to tap into our Active Directory users and computers, so we don't have to have another password to go to Canvas. Now it's not quite the same as a domain trust, but it just steals the chunk of Active Directory that does authentication. That's it. And there's one for mobile, for module and Windows PowerShell, which we're not going to get into. So when we do this, it installs Active Directory as a service. You're kind of familiar with services, right? We've done that before. And so we're going to go through and we're going to pick it off of the features list. And then once it gets installed, it installs as a service, which means from now on, whenever you boot this guy up, he's not going to boot up in just plain old Windows Server. He's going to wake up as Windows Server with Active Directory turned on. That's how it's done, through a service. So on page 128, the main machine that handles this is called a domain controller. Now we only have one computer, so our computer is obviously going to end up being the domain controller. But in the real world, you can have lots of servers. And let's say you had 5 servers. You had an email server over here and a web server over here and maybe a file server over here. Then you had 2 domain controllers. Now, it's always a good idea to have not just one domain controller, but 2 in case one of them failed, because this is keys to the kingdom. If your domain controller freaked out, you would not be able to log into any machine anywhere in your organization at all because the domain controller's down. It's the one that does authentication, right? You type in your name, okay? So most people, you have 2 domain controllers and they share the load. Now, there are some things that you only have one of, but most of the time, most of Active Directory, 90% of Active Directory can be replicated to as many domain controllers as you want. Okay. So anyway, the older versions had this thing called a primary domain controller and then a secondary. We don't use those terms anymore. That was way back in the Windows NT days, but you may run across it because one of the things they talk about is a primary domain controller emulator. Okay, that's one of the roles. We haven't talked about roles yet. One of the Active Directory roles that cannot be replicated because it can only be one. All right, there's only a few of those roles which only have one copy of. Okay, so now there's no primary, secondary. Anything that happens to one domain controller is going to instantly get replicated to all the rest of the domain controllers in your network, so that someone changes their password. That's a high level event, and so if somebody changes your password and it goes to this domain controller, it's going to stop whatever the heck it's doing. It's a high priority event, and it's going to replicate that to all the rest of the machines, so that once you got finished and hit OK and tried to log in with your new password, it's not going to say, oh, well, I haven't replicated yet. So some things can do slow replication between the domain controllers, but not things like password resets. Okay. So on page 128, they start talking about the thing called a domain. So a domain is the top level thing. It's a logical grouping of computers, users, under the control of a single organization. So for example, in our world, our domain is Temuct. That's the name of our domain at the university. And so all the machines belong to the Temuct domain. We could have a subdomain. Maybe we have one like for researchers. Since we have a bunch of research things going on, we might want to have one called, research.temuct.edu. That'd be kind of cool, right? And that way it could have and the only reason you want to do that is if you had slightly different people involved, like more administrators on the research, but none of the, that doesn't apply to anywhere else, that kind of stuff. Okay. So each company creates their domain for their own organization. Now, it would be a cool idea that you would go ahead and register that domain with the honest-to-God domain registration system for the internet, but it's not required. In other words, the names don't even have to match. So at our university, we are, temuct.edu, okay? But our domain name is not Temuct. Believe it or not, it's AMCT, okay? So they don't have to match. They don't have to. But most people do. They make them the same. Okay. But what if you never intended to connect your domain to the internet at all? Ever? Well, then who cares, right? You're going to have a name, so create kumquat. Who cares? Right? All right. But most people want the outward-facing domain. By the way, I'm using those two terms. They're not the same. A outward-facing domain from internet perspective is not the same as the Active Directory domain. They use the same words, but they're not the same thing. Okay, let's continue. All right. So it'd be nice if you had a registered domain that matched. Okay. So the Active Directory would match the database, the web domain, the address, everything. All right. So a tree domain. So Active Directory could have several trees. In other words, this is my real one, my tree. And I could have another one down. So they have one for the programming group and one for IT training. So in our case, theoretically, we could have our AMCT, and then we could have a research.amct. Okay, that kind of thing. So one giant thing, and the big thing is called a forest. Run, forest, run. No. So the top level domain, then you have multiple lower level domains. So the very first domain you install is both the domain and the tree. You have to have a tree. Even if you don't have any subs, you still have to have a tree. So later on, when we start building this thing in the hands-on section, we're going to say, it's going to come up and say, hey, is this a brand new thing? And I say, yeah, it's a brand new tree. And then I give it the name of the domain. Okay, cool. All right. So to create this first domain, you go through this system called promotion. We're going to do that in the hands-on, where you bring up our guy, go to the little server manager guy, and say, we're gonna promote this guy to a domain controller. That's how it's done. Okay. So on page 130 is nothing rocket science here. Yes, a group of domains make up a forest. Okay, a forest. Weird. And child domains, yeah, a child domain makes plenty of sense, right? You have a tree domain, and then we have a child. Now, can I connect two trees together? Well, you can do that thing called trusts. I can connect one of my chunks in my tree to one of your chunks in another tree. Maybe it's just this child domain that gets connected, nobody else. So let's say some other organization, I don't know, we're partnered with, Kumquat Industries, and they have a research thing. And so we just want to connect our one little guy to their little guy using this thing called a forest trust. Okay, cool. All right. Now, this is kind of weird. Forests do not have to have a continuous namespace. You could, this sounds a little silly, but you don't actually even have to follow. See how this one is a programming.Ducati, and then this one is just IT training local? In other words, this one, clearly you can tell that's a child. But here, this is another tree. So this one is a child because it contains a name. So you can have another tree organization within your forest. We're not going to do that. In fact, I can't imagine too many scenarios that would actually make sense. But it's available there. So here's a scenario where you might want to do this. Let's say you're a company and you bought out your rival, okay? But you want to grab them and put them into your forest, but you don't want to have to go through the pain and agony of going through and rearranging everything. So you just basically not steal, you know what I'm talking about. You just grab their domain and just tuck it under your domain. And so now presto chango. It may be, here's the new name of the company and the old name of the company when it stays there, because that way you could spend all the time in the world transitioning over the new users from the new company into your system. Or maybe you're lazy, you just leave them. Use your old credentials like you've always had. There's no change, that kind of stuff. That'd be kind of cool. Okay. So well, shucks, we're coming up on the 15-minute mark. Let's try this again in a couple of minutes.